Johnstown, Pennsylvania, May 31st, 1889. On that rainy Friday morning, at the steel mills running along the Conemaugh River, workers arrived to start the morning shift. In the working-class neighborhoods, mothers worried inside their homes at that heavy sky and decided whether to let their children go to school or keep them home. And because of all the rain, merchants stacked goods on the upper floors of downtown warehouses. Because the Conemaugh River had risen too much during the night, something that happened frequently enough that the residents of Johnstown already knew exactly what to do when the water started to rise. The dam had been built decades earlier to supply Pennsylvania's canal system and later sold to a leisure club frequented by the richest men in Pittsburgh, industrialists and bankers who used the artificial lake to fish and boat during the summer. In the years following the purchase, club members made a series of modifications to the dam to lower the water level and widen the road that ran over it. Modifications that directly contributed to the disaster that was about to happen. Johnstown in 1889 was a city built on steel, located at the bottom of a narrow valley where the Conemaugh River met the Little Conemaugh and Stony Creek. The city had grown up around the steel mills of the Cambria Iron Company, one of the largest steel producers in the United States at the time, which employed thousands of workers from Ireland, Germany, Wales, and Central Europe who had arrived in previous decades in search of work in Pennsylvania's factories. The steel mills ran 24 hours a day in rotating shifts that never stopped, with furnaces that lit up the night sky of the valley with an orange glow visible from the surrounding hills. Workers coming off the night shift crossed paths with those arriving for the morning shift on still dark streets, their faces marked by soot and the heat of the furnaces, walking back to the wooden houses of the working-class neighborhoods that spread along the riverbanks and the lower slopes of the hills that surrounded the city on all sides. Among these families was Anna Fenn, daughter of Irish immigrants, who lived with her husband John and their 7 children in a house on Locust Street, across from the Methodist Church, on one of those Johnstown streets where everyone knew their neighbor's name and where children grew up together among the same wooden houses and the same familiar stores. The life Anna had built there over the decades was the same life of thousands of other families who had transformed that narrow Pennsylvania valley into one of the most important industrial centers in the United States. Johnstown had 30,000 inhabitants spread across an area that geography made naturally vulnerable to flooding. The valley was narrow and the surrounding hills were high, which meant that any excessive volume of water coming down the rivers converging on the city had few places to go, other than the streets and the first floors of homes and businesses. Minor floods were so frequent that residents had developed their own routine for dealing with them, moving furniture to upper floors, taking animals to higher ground, and waiting for the water to recede before cleaning the mud left on the walls and floors. And that constant familiarity had over time also become a way of underestimating the risk. 14 kilometers above the city, the South Fork Dam held back a volume of water equivalent to San Francisco Bay. It had been built decades earlier to supply Pennsylvania's canal system, and later sold to the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, a private club frequented by the richest men in Pittsburgh, including Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, and Andrew Mellon, who used the artificial lake to fish and boat during the summer. In the years following the purchase, club members removed the original relief valves that allowed the volume of retained water to be controlled, and made modifications to the dam structure that engineers had already classified as dangerous in previous inspections, and warnings about the condition of the structure had reached Johnstown authorities at various points over the preceding years, without any of them generating an evacuation. On the morning of May 31st, 1889, the rain that had not stopped since the previous day had intensified during the night, and the Conemaugh River was already above its normal level when the first workers arrived at the steel mills for the morning shift. In the working-class neighborhood houses closest to the riverbanks, some families had already moved furniture from the ground floor upstairs during the night, a procedure so built into the city's routine that children knew exactly what to do without being told. helping carry chairs, boxes, and belongings up the stairs, while their parents watched the water level from the window. Anna was home with her 7 children that morning, while John had gone out early to help neighbors move their belongings to upper floors. As so many other men in the neighborhood did on that kind of rainy morning, the heavy rain and the rising river were not reason enough for alarm in a city that had lived with flooding for decades. And so Anna prepared breakfast for the children with the same routine of any other rainy Friday spring morning in Pennsylvania. In the downtown churches, morning masses were held with fewer worshipers than usual because of the heavy rain that made the streets difficult to cross on foot. And in the schools, teachers waited in classrooms while students arrived in smaller groups than usual, with soaked clothes and muddy boots. In the downtown warehouses, merchants opened their doors at the usual time and served the first customers of the morning with water already running along the street gutters. At 11 in the morning, a telegraph operator at the South Fork Railroad Station sent a message to Johnstown warning that the dam was overflowing and that there was a risk of rupture. The message arrived and was read, but the decision made by local authorities was not to evacuate the city, partly because similar warnings had come in previous years without anything serious happening, and partly because evacuating 30,000 people from a narrow valley with a single river rising and streets already partially flooded was an operation for which the city had no established plan. And so Johnstown continued its day. In the steel mills, the furnaces kept running. In the working-class neighborhood homes, women prepared lunch while the rain beat on the wooden rooftops. The residents of Johnstown had heard so many times the joke that the dam up there would one day break and sweep them all away, that the phrase had become part of local humor, a way of dealing with a possibility that seemed too remote to be taken seriously. It was Victor Heiser, 16 years old, son of a downtown merchant, who first saw what was coming down the valley that afternoon. He was in the family barn when his father appeared at the upper floor window, gesturing in a way he had never done before. And when Victor climbed onto the roof to get a better view, he immediately understood what his father had seen. A dark mass of water and debris advancing through the valley toward the city at a speed he would later describe as impossible to believe without having seen it with his own eyes. At 3:10 in the afternoon of that Friday, the South Fork Dam gave way completely. The volume of water that had taken decades to accumulate came down the Little Conemaugh Valley in a 14-meter-high wall, carrying with it trees, locomotives, entire houses, and everything it found in its path, advancing toward Johnstown at approximately 40 kilometers per hour. Time enough for some residents of the towns between the dam and Johnstown to try to warn the city by telegraph, but not enough for any warning to turn into an evacuation. In downtown Johnstown, the water reached the main streets within minutes, tearing wooden buildings from their foundations and sweeping everything away in the current, forming masses of debris that moved through the entire city. Anna was inside the house with her 7 children when the water came in, and she held the baby while the older children tried to cling to her. But the force of the current inside the house itself was impossible to resist, and one after another the children were carried away by the water, along with John, who had gone out in the morning to help the neighbors and never came back. Victor was swept down the valley, clinging to the planks of the barn roof, dodging locomotives, animals and house debris moving at the same speed as him, until the current threw him against the roof of a 2-story brick house that was still standing, and he managed to grab on and climb up, spending the night in the attic with 19 other survivors while the water level rose and fell around the structure. Residents who managed to reach the upper floors of more solid masonry buildings, such as churches and Alma Hall, a 4-story building in the city center where Reverend David Beale spent the night with dozens of terrified neighbors, managed to survive watching from above the destruction taking over the streets below. The most devastating moment of the night came when the debris piled up against the stone bridge in the city center caught fire, creating a blaze that burned for days and that consumed not only the rubble of the destroyed houses, but also the people who had survived the flood, but were trapped among the planks and beams the current had piled against the bridge. Reverend Beale described that night in Alma Hall as a night of indescribable horrors, with people clinging to stair railings while water poured through broken windows, and the distant glow of the fire at the bridge lit the hall where there was no electric light. On the morning of June 1st, when the water had receded enough for survivors to move through the streets, what remained of Johnstown was not a destroyed city. It was a valley covered in meters of mud, debris, and rubble, from houses that hours before had been homes, with family photographs, furniture bought with years of savings, and Sunday clothes mixed into the mud and detritus the current had spread for kilometers in every direction. The working-class neighborhoods where families had developed their routine of living with floods simply no longer existed. The marks on the walls indicating how high the water had reached in previous floods were meters below the level the water had reached that Friday. Anna Fenn survived, clinging to the debris of her own home, swept through the valley, pregnant and alone, having lost John and all 7 children that afternoon. In the days that followed, she walked through the survivor camps and the places where bodies were being collected, looking for her children, one by one. For the same reason all the other mothers of Johnstown walked through those same places in those days. In testimony recorded later, she described each of her children by name, by date of birth, and by how she had tried to hold them when the water came through the door. None of them were found alive. Victor Heiser spent the night in the attic of the brick house with 19 survivors and left in the morning, walking over the debris covering the streets, in a scene he would describe decades later in his memoirs as something his mind had taken years to fully process. He was 16 years old and had lost both parents in seconds that afternoon. He became a doctor years later and devoted much of his life to international public health work, having stated in interviews that the memory of Johnstown had never entirely left him. The Red Cross, led by Clara Barton, arrived in Johnstown 5 days after the disaster and set up what she called Red Cross hotels, temporary structures that housed survivors for months while the city tried to reorganize. More than $3 million in donations arrived from across the United States and from 18 foreign countries, including Russia, France, Germany, and Great Britain, in a mobilization that was the largest civilian disaster relief operation in American history up to that point. Volunteer workers from Pittsburgh arrived by train to help remove the rubble. Doctors and nurses came from neighboring cities. The Army was sent to maintain order in a city whose municipal structure had disappeared, along with much of the buildings that housed it. The survivors of Johnstown tried to hold the members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club legally responsible for the negligence that had caused the dam to rupture. All the lawsuits were dismissed. Pennsylvania courts classified the disaster as an act of God, a decision that protected Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, and the other club members from any legal responsibility for the more than 2,200 deaths caused by the dam they had bought, modified, and neglected for years. Carnegie donated a library to the reconstruction of Johnstown. It was the only consequence the richest men in Pittsburgh faced for what had happened that May afternoon. Johnstown was rebuilt. The streets came back. The steel mills started running again. The families that survived tried to rebuild what they had lost, knowing that a part of what had existed before that Friday would never return, because 99 entire families had completely disappeared, leaving no survivor to tell what had happened to them. 1/3 of the dead were never identified. Some bodies were found months later in cities hundreds of kilometers away, carried by the Conemaugh Current into larger rivers that took them far from the valley where they had lived. If you made it to the end of this documentary, thank you so much for watching. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment what you thought. See you in the next video.